Welcome back. Now that we've heard Sherburne, we're going to move on to other religious paths. The Calvinist churches attended by English-speaking colonists maintained a high profile during the 18th century. But the Calvinists were by no means the only denomination to practice their faith in that era. The associated musical practices among other groups varied dramatically. For instance, the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, was supported by tax revenues from the Carolinas, Georgia, Virginia, because it was recognized as the official church of these colonies. The organ was central to Anglican services, in a marked contrast to the Calvinist churches that strictly forbade its use. The first known pipe organ installation in a colonial church occurred in Boston in 1714. The congregation then persuaded a British musician to come and be their organist. And he was soon renowned for his ability to, quote, play skillfully with a loud noise, thereby earning the criticism of Cotton Mather and other Calvinist ministers. Not all religious practices in that era were Christian. Native Americans, for instance, sustained very different cosmologies, a term that describes one's view of the universe and the way it is ordered, from those of European immigrants. The balance between humankind and nature was seldom a consideration in the 18th century Christian church, but this was central to most Native American peoples, who viewed all aspects of the world as interconnected, with music functioning within that shared experience. The colonists had very limited awareness or comprehension of Native American music and rituals, in part because they were excluded from many ceremonial practices, and mostly because they just didn't care. To this day, some Native Americans feel that no aspects of their belief, their songs, their customs, should be shared with outsiders, not even members of other tribes, let alone non-Native Americans. Still, to be respectful of those boundaries, the musical example Ho-Way Hey-Yo that has been chosen to represent colonial-era Native American music is a social dance rather than a selection from a ceremonial ritual, although the dividing line between the two can often be quite blurry. Therefore, the discussion of its musical features will appear in Section 3 of the guide and listening example 6. There were other immigrant Christian communities in various places in the colonies with musical practices that varied sharply from the more mainstream Calvinist or Anglican traditions. They tended to be populated by more recent arrivals who came to America more than a century after the first Puritan and Pilgrim ships had landed. Because the majority of the residents in these communities did not speak English, the newer groups tended to remain separated. In some settlements, music was extremely important and was greatly admired by the few outsiders who became aware of these practices. In particular, the Moravian brethren achieved a level of musical sophistication that was far ahead of the rest of the colonies, and which would not be matched by other American groups until the 19th century. The Moravians. The Moravian Church's original name was Unitas Fratrum, Unity of Brethren. The denomination originated in what is now the Czech Republic, even before the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation was the rebellion or protest against the Catholic Church that had been triggered by Martin Luther in 1517. The Moravian sect nearly collapsed during the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 that devastated much of Central Europe. But after the war's end, the few survivors found refuge with an aristocrat in Saxony, now part of Germany. The nobleman, Count Niklaus Ludwig von Zinzendorf, 1700 to 1760, encouraged the performance of hymns, even leading singing classes himself. With this protection, the Moravian Brethren began to put their own energies toward missionary efforts. The musical impact of the Moravians was felt even before they arrived in America. The last of the 13 original colonies, Georgia, was founded in 1732 to serve as a buffer between Florida, controlled by the Spanish, and the Carolinas. It was named in honor of England's monarch, King George II. Georgia's founder was the Englishman James Edward Oglethorpe, 1696 to 1785. A progressive leader in a number of regards. He was the driving force behind the Act of 1735, a law forbidding slavery in the new colony. Sadly, after Oglethorpe left Georgia, many of his policies were dismantled, and thus slavery was legally introduced in 1751. Oglethorpe viewed religious groups as helping to stabilize the new colony, so he encouraged immigrants such as the 26 Moravian missionaries who set sail toward Georgia in 1735. When a rough storm struck the ship during the voyage, they remained on deck and sang hymns. On board was a young Anglican minister named John Wesley, who marveled at their calm, prompting him to begin studying a borrowed copy of their German language hymnal. Wesley, who eventually founded the Methodist Church, issued a collection of psalms and hymns in 1737, thereby publishing the first Anglican hymnal in colonial America, although some of its contents were older hymns that he had translated. John Wesley and his brother Charles are said to have written some 8,000 original hymns over the course of their lives. Although the Moravians, the first mission to Georgia, ultimately failed and was abandoned, they had much better success with settlements further north. Bethlehem in Pennsylvania and Salem, now in Winston-Salem, in North Carolina, grew to be the two leading centers of the Moravian Church. Later in the 18th century, the music making in those hubs was much more cosmopolitan than in other colonial communities of the time, in part because the Moravian commitment to the instrumental music, not just vocal, and to secular as well as sacred compositions. Puritans were resistant to instruments in church because they were, quote, tainted by their frequent use in popular music. A Moravian church leader retorted that performing only vocal music in church would not fix the problem, since the same mouths that would sing sacred tunes would also be used in, quote, eating sausage. In comparison to the a cappella performances heard in Calvinist churches, Moravian compositions resembled the more elaborate music being composed in Europe by musicians such as Franz Joseph Haydn, 1732 to 1809. Ironically and humorously, in particular, the Moravians loved trombones, using them for celebrations, funerals, civic ceremonies, and announcements. A trombone choir serenaded George Washington during his 1782 visit to Bethlehem. Similarly, when a member of the community died, trombonists would assemble in the church tower and play a somber tune that would be heard throughout the town. The community also might use the trombone simply to herald new arrivals in their remote settlements, as they did at 6 p.m. on June 15th in 1780, when, quote, several wagons carrying 10 Moravian brethren, sisters, and 4 teamsters made their way into Salem. One of those passengers was Johann Friedrich Peter, 1746 to 1813. Moravian composer who would first publish instrumental chamber music in America. Peter came from one of his string quintets that will be addressed in section 3 as listening example 8. Esoteric Ephrata. Another yet very different German-speaking sect, the Ephrata cloister, was also established in Pennsylvania. Ephrata, meaning beautiful, was the brainchild of Conrad Bissell, 1691 to 1768. Bissell was born in Germany, regarded his Lutheran upbringing as too lax. He soon found himself battling his local church authorities. And like a number of other Lutherans, he chose pietism as his creed, a practice that focused on individual devotion with careful attention to biblical teachings. Bissell chose to emigrate to America in 1720, where he started developing a sect based on his beliefs of austere self-denial, celibacy, and pious simplicity. Like the Moravians, he valued hymns as a way to express religious feelings. In 1730, he published a volume of hymn texts that he and other early converts had written. 7 years earlier than John Wesley's hymn collection, with German poetry, not English. The hymnal was printed by Benjamin Franklin as a note. By 1732, Bissell's personal convictions and religious views had attracted enough followers that he established the Ephrata cloister, about 60 miles from Philadelphia. Members of the settlement ate no meat or eggs, since Bissell felt those, quote, aroused numerous capricious cravings. He also believed the community's limited diet would produce a limber, clear singing voice. He favored a, quote, soft, polished, otherworldly sound, and he led his singers in rehearsals that often ran for hours. In essence, Ephrata was a monastic society with men and women living apart from each other in separate dormitories and foregoing marriage. They did collaborate with the householders living adjacent to the community, consisting of married families who attended weekly services held on Saturdays, but who did not participate in other aspects of the Ephrata cloister's austere lifestyle. Some of Ephrata's uncommon practices were the wearing of tonsures, a shaved patch on the top of the skull, along with white garments. Around 1738, Bissell and his followers also adopted spiritual names, with Bissell referred to himself as Father Friedsam Gottrecht, peaceable, right with God. By the late 1740s, Ephrata's population had grown to approximately 300 people, but their celibate lifestyle meant there were no descendants. After the charismatic Beisel died in 1768, the number of adherents rapidly declined. Two brothers rejected the community's pacifist creed and fought in the Revolutionary War. In 1777 and 78, George Washington requisitioned one of the dormitories to the house for almost 260 wounded and ill soldiers. 60 of them died, along with several Ephrata members who nursed soldiers suffering from disease. The last of the celibate sisters passed away in 1813, and the remaining householder families reorganized themselves as German Seventh-day Baptists the following year. Beisel left his distinctive mark on Ephrata's music making as well. One of the primary activities of the community was the production of hymns, which they generated by the hundreds. There are two dimensions to this occupation: the words and the music. The two components were handled in different ways. First, like the early Calvinist psalters, the Ephrata cloister published volumes of words-only hymn texts. Benjamin Franklin printed not only their inaugural collection in 1730, but two more volumes in 1732 and 1736. The printer, Christopher Sauer, then issued their 1739 collection. At some point in the early 1740s, the Ephrata cloister acquired a printing press. They then learned how to manufacture paper and ink and to tan leather, enabling them to print and bind hymnals themselves. The first product of their new press was the Song of the Lonely and Forsaken Turtle Dove, namely the Christian Church, often referred simply as Turtle Taube. The poems in this 1747 hymnal were exclusively by Ephrata members. Because the printed hymnals presented solely the words of Ephrata, also maintained a scriptorium, a workshop devoted to creating manuscripts, handwritten copies of music. The manuscripts were the responsibility of the Sisterhood of Ephrata. In other words, the manuscript scores contain the notable notated music for the various hymns, but not the complete poetry. So the manuscript volumes were intended to be used in partnership with the printed texts. The manuscripts would include the first stanza of each poem, but some hymns had as many as 20 verses, so the singers would look in the printed hymnals to complete their performance. A missionary visiting Ephrata in 1753 described the brethren and sisters who sat in cross seats in front having psalm books and also notebooks, so the text and hymnals on one hand and the music manuscripts on the other. In addition to notating the music, the Ephrata sisters filled out the edges of the pages with beautiful illustrated designs. If you consult your guide, you'll see that figure 2.3. With the steady outpouring of printed hymnal text, the sisterhood was kept busy producing the corresponding hand-notated music. The visiting missionary observed that the younger sisters are mostly employed in drawing. A part of them are just now constantly employed in, quote, copying musical notebooks for themselves and the brethren. I saw some of these upon which a wonderful amount of labor had been expended, end quote. One of the most significant products of the Ephrata scriptorium is a massive volume known as the Ephrata Codex, completed in 1746. The title page reads, De Britra Susa, the bittersweet and it contains the music of some 750 hymns, some that correlated with the 1739 Christopher Sour hymnal, and the rest corresponding to the Turtle Taub that would be published the following year. The typical layout of the volume when the codex is opened, the music and the poetic text are read across the page break. The text of the listening example 2, which begins at the bottom of the left-hand page with the words Die Sante Bewungung die Lieblich Kraft die Bay, continues in the lower portion of the right-hand page with Mir sich riget und die mich bewegt. Music is read the same way. The lettering is an old-fashioned calligraphic style called Fraktur. It can be a little hard to read since the letters such as the lowercase f and s look very similar. A historian, Christopher Herbert, notes because the Ephrata produced no heirs, its documents were scattered and its tradition mostly forgotten. The Ephrata Codex is a case in point. Peter Miller, who became the leader of the Ephrata community after Beisel's death, gave the codex to Benjamin Franklin in 1771. In 1775, Franklin, in turn, gave it to John Wilkes, an English member of Parliament who was sympathetic to the American rebels' cause. The volume was not located again for another 150 years until it turned up in an auction in 1927. An antiquarian purchased it for $475, but believing it belonged to the public, he sold it and turned to the Library of Congress for the same price that he had paid. Recently, conservators at the library have uploaded a high-resolution scan of the entire document, making it available to the general public. Before the Library of Congress posted its scanned copy of the Ephrata Codex, Christopher Herbert took photographs of the volume as part of his dissertation research in 2017. A few months later, when looking at his photos more closely, he made an exciting discovery. A number of the settings had the names of specific composers alongside the musical notation, and 3 of those names were women. Previously, scholars had thought that Beisel had been the sole composer of the Ephrata Codex. The credit boxes are small, but quite clear, or as Herbert puts it, they are hidden in plain sight. He thus unveiled evidence for the earliest known colonial works by female composers. One of the composer's identifications, Furben, is shown in figure 2.4 in your packet, and when it's enlarged, the image from the lower left-hand page is shown in figure 2.3. Not a lot is known about the 5 composers. The best documented is Brother Jabez, which was the devotional name taken by Peter Miller, who later gave his codex to Franklin. Brother Theonius, his pre-Ephrata name is unknown, but we know that he died in March 5th, 1773, and Sister Keturah was Catherine Hageman, born around 1718, and died in 1797. Sister Hannah, born around 1714 in Germany, as Hannah Lichty, died on Halloween, October 31st, 1793. And then Sister Furben, composer of the passage that we are about to listen to, was born Christiana Lasso and died in 1784. Therefore, she would have been in her late 20s when the Ephrata Codex was assembled. The Codex contains two of Sister Phoban's compositions. Her other hymn is titled Formier mein Topfer, Give Shape to Me, my Potter. So, that brings us to the end of this section. In the next section, we are going to take a look at listening section 2 and Sister Phoban's piece. I will talk to you soon.